Hello, and welcome to Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you for joining us. My name is Brian Benjamin, and I'm the chair of Manhattan Community Board 10, which encompasses Central Harlem. Today, we are talking about the proposed Housing Preservation and Development Regulatory Agreement governing HDFCs. My guests today are Gayle Davis, who is a HDFC shareholder, John McBride with the HDFC Coalition, and Mark Matthews with HPD Asset Management. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Well, this issue exploded onto my desk when I went to the July Borough Board meeting that our Borough President Gayle Brewer has, and we had on the agenda the HDFCs and the regulatory agreement. I know you guys will get more into what that all means. And literally what's normally a calm meeting was explosive. We had well more than the tents that we normally have. And it was like, well, what is going on? And I reached out to the chair of our HDFC committee, a subcommittee, Danny Tyson, who's very knowledgeable in the area, and said, you know, we as a community board at Central Harlem, since we have so many of these HDFCs, we need to start figuring out what our position is on this. But before we do that, many of us don't even know what the issue is. And so that's what we want to try to get to on this show. What is this all about? Why is there so much fuss and fighting and concerns about this? So why don't I start with you, Mark? Talk a little bit about what is an HDFC for our viewers, how does this work, sure. and give us a little context for how we got here.
Sure. Let me start from the beginning. Basically, HDFCs are Housing Development Fund corporations, and for the purpose of the buildings that we're going to talk about today, they were city-owned buildings that were basically abandoned by their landlords back in the 70s, early 80s. They came into a HPD sponsored program. Actually, there were 3 programs: Tenant Interim Lease Program, TIL, Community Management Program, CMP, and then there was the Urban Homesteading Program, UHP. These buildings, they were probably in the kind of worst, landlord abandoned them, the tenants kind of organized, got themselves together, they came into the programs, and they succeeded in being able to buy their apartments. The sale price for the apartments at that time was $250 per unit. So we sold these HDFCs, Housing Development Fund Corporation, to the tenants. Now, what basically a HDFC is basically under the New York State Article 11 co-op law, and they're supposed to provide low-income housing for the residents of the building.
Gotcha.
Right.
So John and Gayle, you both live in HDFCs. Now, John, not only do you live in HDFC, you're part of a coalition that's very active on this topic. Talk a little bit about why did you buy into HDFC, and sort of what your involvement has been thus far.
So I came to my HDFC about 15, 16 years ago, about the year 2000. This is Lower Harlem, before a lot of the recent changes in Harlem that we're very well aware of. It was quite a different neighborhood at that time. Much of the block actually was not occupied. They were abandoned, they were empty buildings blocked up. It was pretty easy to park. It's not so easy to park anymore. And the building itself, I actually found out about the building through I'm now on the steering committee of the HDFC Coalition, but I found out about the building through the HDFC Coalition at that time, many years ago. And this building was looking for some people who were really willing to roll up their sleeves, because many of the buildings, including this building where I live, was turned over to the tenants in very, very poor condition. And this is not a slam necessarily at anyone or the city specifically. The city was on the verge of bankruptcy years ago, and the city had foreclosed on so many properties in order to try, they were making the foreclosure easy to try to increase their tax collections from the landlords, but it completely backfired on the city. And the city overnight became the biggest slumlord in town. And the expenses that the city was incurring were astronomical. So quickly they had to get rid of these buildings. So this building is one of many that was in very poor condition, elevator resting in the basement. The apartments that were available, some of them had holes in the floor that you could see down into the basement, completely destroyed bathrooms and kitchens, plaster falling from the ceiling, complete disrepair. So,
gotcha. So you got into the HDFC, you bought in, and then you and your fellow shareholders fix up the building. Is that what you're
Right,
basically
with
saying?
our own money, our own two hands.
Gotcha.
Yes.
All right, hold on, let's come back. All right, go ahead, Gayle. Gayle Davis, talk a little bit about your story and how you got involved in HDFC.
Well, when I moved back to New York City in 1998, I was apartment hunting, and I was lucky enough to find an apartment where I currently live. And I went into the building not knowing it was an HDFC immediately as a renter. And after living there for a couple of years and finding out more about HDFCs and the affordability of being able to buy and own some real estate in New York City, I inquired, and about 10 years ago, I was made an offer by the board of directors to buy into my apartment, which I did. My understanding at the time of buying it, it was not just low income, but middle income. And this was a way for me to assure my ability to stay in New York City, own real estate, and have something as a person who is about to retire that would fortify my income so that I knew that in the future I had a home and my children had a home. And particularly at that point, I was a single parent. My son was in high school and getting ready to go to college. So having a good place to live, affordability, and something for the future made a big difference for me.
Fair enough. All right, so Mark, let's get into the regulatory agreement, the proposed regulatory agreement. Just explain to us why are you proposing this regulatory agreement, and what are some of the things you hope to achieve by bringing this regulatory agreement to the table?
Well, I think the key thing is to preserve affordability in these buildings. I mean, we're starting to see a trend towards higher price sales. I mean, clearly it's the subletting issue that's coming up. I mean, we want to address distressed buildings. We're losing a lot of our HDFCs through what's called third-party transfer, where the tenants, shareholders, for whatever reason, they don't raise their maintenance charges, and they basically don't pay the municipal charges, and they lose the buildings to a third-party owner. We want to preserve affordability, and that's why we basically, pretty much after a year of working on this regulatory agreement, we feel we got a good product to present to shareholders. Obviously, we have to get the city council to bless it, but that's where we're heading at this point.
Well, I got two questions real quickly on that. First, when you say higher price sales, give us a sense of the numbers you're talking about when you say some of these are being sold at higher prices.
Well, HDFCs are subject to income restrictions. Most of the income, there's three different formulas. One is based on maintenance plus utilities. The second one is 120% of AMI, which is for a family of four, I think is 87,000. And then there's another income restriction of 165%. But most of our buildings, the older buildings, have this formula, which is based on what the maintenance charges plus what the cost of the utility charges are, times 6 or times 7 times 12. So there's a formula. In most of our buildings, the maintenance is relatively low. So what you're finding out is gross income for these potential shareholders that move into these buildings are somewhere around $60,000 or something like that. So I think what we're seeing apartments for $350,000, $400,000, $500,000. So you kind of question how someone on that salary can be able to afford to buy a unit in one of these HDFCs for that type of money.
Okay. Now, second question is, when you said you have met with interested stakeholders for over a year, can you give us a sense of who are some of those people? Because we have heard in the community that people felt like they were not part of that conversation. Just give us a sense of who you were talking to when you said
some of the technical advisors. We have dealt not-for-profit folks, some of the attorneys that represent some of the HDFCs, some of the local, like you said, housing groups, basically.
Gotcha. So but you wouldn't say you met with sort of some sampling of the HDFC shareholders
the population,
themselves?
Not at this point. We
Okay.
plan to,
So that's how we got here now.
Right.
Okay. Now, let's, John, talk about your thoughts on the regulatory agreement, things that you like or don't like. Would you suggest that all of it's awful, some of it's good, some of it's bad? Just give us a sense of what you think about it. And then I'm going to ask you to do the same, Gayle, after John.
Well, at the I'm one member.
And summarize, please.
Right.
Okay.
I'm one member of the steering committee of the HDFC Coalitions. So let me just be careful to say
Speak
that.
for yourself.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So I would say, but overwhelmingly, our members feel it's a very, very bad proposal. And I also want to be clear.
In its entirety.
Yes, and let me talk about that. Let me be clear that it's our understanding that there's a lot of focus on the proposed draft of the regulatory agreement, which HPD is still talking about, but it still hasn't made final. So it's hard to sort of see what it really is, number one. Number two, we don't expect that they would actually take this thick regulatory agreement and take it to the city council and ask the city council to pass the regulatory agreement. What we expect that they would do is ask the city council to pass some very vague language as a part of an omnibus tax resolution that would say something very vague and powerful, like in order to continue to receive a damp tax abatement, which is what part of what we're talking about, and we need to talk about that because that's why it's coercive and it's a key part of this. So and if you want to continue to enjoy the damp tax abatement, which makes these buildings affordable for the low-income and moderate-income people who live in them, then you must have a signed regulatory agreement, something like that. Right. So that, if they, and they would probably make an argument, well, we need to do this, and if something is determined to be invalid or illegal, we'd have to take it out. So they would most likely want very broad, very powerful authority to write whatever regulatory agreement they want. So they could have multiple versions. And if it's not mandated that they offer it, they could use discretion. And when we're talking about this, it's just so important.
So your issue is with the process, not necessarily with the regulatory
No, there's
agreement.
multiple issues.
All right, so I got you on that one. So let's assume, for argument's sake, that the regulatory agreement that has been proposed is the one that's going to be presented. I hear what you're saying about all the tricks. But what are your issues? What do you like or not like within the regulatory agreement itself?
Right. Well, I'm going to still have to go to a half step because the thing is, what HPD, what we understand, they want to ask the city council. We have a damp tax rate, which stands for the Division of Alternative Management Program, which is part of HPD, which concerns these buildings. And that tax rate was designed and passed by the city council to make HDFCs affordable for the people who live in them, because they don't want the buildings to go bankrupt. That's how they ended up with them in the first place. And that tax rate is not set to expire until the year 2029. They want the city council to eliminate this almost immediately. Let's say 12 months.
So you're not talking about the regulatory agreement.
I am. Because what they want to do is eliminate that and then reinstitute it. But when they reinstitute it, you have to have a regulatory agreement to get it.
Agreed. So let's talk about the regulatory agreement. I got it. So what in the regulatory agreement do you like or not like? That's what I'm just asking. Leave out all that other stuff. What do you like or not like?
So,
and then I'm going to get to you.
So that point was just that it's coercive.
I got it.
So we feel that this is really, what HPD is really sort of focused on is what's sort of in their face, which is that smaller percentage on the low end that are of HDFCs that are in a lot of trouble and failing. So they want, I think their thinking is they want control of these buildings, and they're ignoring the ones in the middle.
Let's stay out of HPD's head. I just want you to tell me, within the regulatory agreement, the different points, what do you like or not like? Forget what HPD is doing. Let's just take the regulatory agreement. What do you like or not like within it? Forget them for a second. Let's just talk about the language. Let's assume the community board. Let's assume the community, and I don't want to harp on this, but I want us to get to. Let's assume my community board said, "This is a resolution we're passing with these things in it." What do you like or not like within those things, as you know it?
Well, the board, most HDFCs are doing fine, and this would require the board to hand over control to a monitor that would have to board decisions, and who knows the building better other than the people who live there. And this monitor would have to be paid for. So it's a policeman that they're requiring that we hire. And we assume there would be a short list of these policemen. So there's really the choice isn't much of a choice.
All right. Next.
That's one.
So you have the policeman. What else?
Right. They're trying to change the rules for decades. The rules that have been have been in place for approximately 40 years. And people have built their lives around these. So some people, and this gets to some of what Mark has talked about, so the whole time there have been income restrictions. But there were no asset restrictions, meaning if you had...
You're against asset restrictions?
Yes.
And
there were no price caps.
You're against price caps?
Correct.
Okay, great. Let's pause on that. Gayle, what are your thoughts?
It seemed very restrictive to me when I first started hearing about what was going on, to the extent that I felt that I'm a homeowner. I've gone out, I had to deal with banks, I had to get a mortgage, so I'm not only paying maintenance, I'm also paying a mortgage. And now, what I bought my home under, they want to pull the rug out from under me and change the rules in the middle of the game.
Gotcha.
And that was very concerning. I found if it was going to be this restrictive, as how I've read it so far, I would have stayed a renter. As a renter, I think I had more freedom than I would with the rules they're trying to institute now. One of the things that concern me is that there's a head count in terms of how many nights are you staying in your apartment, in your home.
Right.
This is my home. Yes, it's my primary residence. Yes, I will have it on my driver's license. I will have that addressed on my tax registrations. I will have it on my voter registrations. But for you to tell me how many nights I have to stay in my primary home is intrusive. As a retired person, does that not mean I can't go away for certain periods of time and travel? And there are many retired people that also are HDFC owners. So that was one thing. In terms of subletting, they've curtailed or put a certain finite number on it. I think that should be a board decision. I'm very concerned that part of what HDFC's was about was the effect of self-governance, governance, and the fact that we have boards that are effective, and yes, I understand there are boards that are not, but then focus on that.
Oh, I see. Got it. Fair enough. Mark, you heard a couple of thoughts from both John and Gayle. What's your response to that in terms of, I'm assuming you thought about this when you came with the regulatory agreement. What are your thoughts on some of those points, and then we'll...
Well, I just want to first talk about the monitor.
Sure.
There will be a requirement that each HDFC that signs a regulatory agreement sign up with the monitor. We'll do a request for qualifications. We'll get a...
Why do you want to monitor?
To basically assist the boards when it comes to units being sold, that they follow the income requirements.
So wait a second. So you're saying that as it stands now, a board could sell outside of the income requirements that are attached to the...
There's a possibility, yes.
Okay.
I mean, I've seen several website, apartments for sale, and I've seen the brokers say no income restrictions, no nothing. You could basically buy the apartment, and the next day you can sublet it out to. And that's what these are the type of things that we see.
Right.
Well, I definitely see. I
Right.
mean, concerning these HDFCs, that some boards basically, say you could do whatever you want with the apartment.
Got it.
And that's not what we want. I mean,
That
we
was
want
not the
these to
original.
be affordable housing. This was the whole purpose of this program when it was started. And I think a lot of the new shareholders that are moving into the building are losing sight of that. I don't know if they even understood what they were buying into. They just seen apartment that was for sale. I mean, I think people should do their research before they, buy into HDFCs.
Gotcha. So I'm gonna push on you two a little bit. So John, you made the point about a monitor. Explain to me, why is it inappropriate for the city that provides a tax benefit, right, through DAMP, and I believe in some buildings there's an HPD loan that's also still in there. Why is it inappropriate for that benefit to be provided without that HPD having some sort of way of monitoring what's going on? Like, why? Like, I have a company, right? We have an investor. Our investor says, I'm sitting on the board. Certain things you got to do. I need to prove. Why is that? What's wrong with that?
Well, we don't even know what it would actually look like. It's an expense that the buildings don't currently incur.
Gotcha.
We don't know how much it would cost. We don't think it's right. We think that the boards know better how to run their buildings.
Let me ask you a question. I have heard of a number of boards that have not been selling apartments, illegal subletting, a range of issues. I mean, these are things that some shareholders have said. They don't have access to the board,
this is correct.
blah, blah, blah. How do you recommend HPD deals with that issue?
Well, I mean,
If it's not to be something like this, how would that get dealt with? Because that can't stand too. You would agree.
Oh,
right?
sure.
Okay.
Listen, we have members of our own coalition who are fighting this tooth and nail, but also want to improve their own buildings, and they also, I mean, not all of them, but some of them have told us that they want to get rid of issues, clean up things in their own building, and we support that. And we think that the HDFC, we think we should all follow the rules.
Right.
And I believe that personally. I don't like to hear about those kinds of things, but I think a lot of people
But how do you follow the rules?
Well, there's different ways. First
without-
of all, there's a lot of things can be cleaned up in an HDFC or any co-op through shareholder education. Some people might not realize that if the board hasn't called an election with 10% of the shareholders, they can call an election. They may not realize they can correct some of these problems. And a lot of these problems could be simply fixed. I mean, if you have, let's say, a really entrenched problem that might, let's say there's something very strange happened, like someone somehow bought a second apartment and they're subletting it.
That's right.
Right? Maybe you cross a certain line where that person has title to those shares, and it might become difficult. Maybe there's a way to assist the rest of the shareholders to get legal representation and take that to court. Some people have suggested they would love the State Attorney General's office to take more interest in HDFC. So let's say you had a certain number of shareholders who are very aware that there's certain things going on and they want these things fixed, but they don't want to hand over control of the whole building for 40 years.
Gotcha.
So, and the attorney, if the Attorney General took an interest, and if those shareholders wanted that, then that might be a method of dealing with those issues without handing over the control of the building, which is not what we want.
Gayle, one of the things you mentioned was the subletting issue. Do you think it's okay for me to buy into HDFC and then basically move out and rent that to someone else and kind of almost be more of a landlord than a homeowner?
I'm not asking that, but there are opportunities for people sometime to travel, to live with another family member, to take care of them. And the board can look at those things and do on a case-by-case basis. But to say I can only within a 5-year period sublet my apartment or my home for 18 months, I think is restrictive. Who are you to determine outside of knowing what my personal circumstances are? This isn't just an apartment. I'm not in Section 8.
Right.
I've bought this home. I've invested money in it. And whether I've invested a lot of money or a little money in it, I've put my life to live in there and help build a community.
Right.
So if I'd like to take time out to go help raise a grandchild, to travel, to do something else, how are you going to tell me what I can do within my own
So you
home?
believe a year and a half out of 5 years is too restrictive?
I feel it is.
What do you say? Would you say 2 years is enough? I mean, like because at some point it looks as if you can basically buy a HDFC and then let someone sublet it.
To be truthful,
which is what we don't want, right?
I've never given it that much thought because right now I'm in my home and I enjoy it and I've never sublet.
Right.
But I'd like a moratorium to think about how long I think it should be. I think that's something that should be, discussed with the other board members and stakeholders who live in the building, who can make that determination.
Fair enough.
Not from an outside.
Fair enough. So, Mark, one of the questions I heard, or comments that I heard, was that with this income cap, in terms of the sale, there are people who have bought at higher prices, they have a mortgage, and by putting this cap on it, they basically couldn't sell because their mortgage would be higher than their income cap. Are you familiar with this issue? And if so, how do you deal with that issue where someone has basically bought under the present regime, and now you're coming with a new structure that basically puts them underwater immediately?
I just want to say, as far as the monitor is concerned, the savings and taxes basically will clearly pay for more than that. I mean, that monitor, and whatever the fee is, we'll make that up in the savings on the real estate taxes.
Gotcha.
If we sign the regulatory agreement. There's a carve-out provision in the regulatory agreement that basically a third of the shareholders can be carved out, the ones that we feel, or the board feels that they pay high prices for their units, and they will be able to still sell their units at 165% of AMI, and there won't be an asset cap for them particular shareholders that bought for a high price. So we kind of made provisions for them particular shareholders.
And to the earlier point that John was going down to in terms of the process, what is the process here? Is it your intention, to do what John was referencing, which is to basically have a little vague comment that the city council passes and then have the regulatory agreement not be approved by the city council directly?
Well, the plan is basically we're going to roll out the regulatory agreement. Hopefully, we're going to put it on the HPD website. It will be available before the end of the month for shareholders that are interested in looking at it. Mm-hmm. Now, obviously, I know it's most the shareholders that are really interested, they already have it. I mean, It's been circulating around. But we're going to hold housing forums in Manhattan, the Bronx, and Brooklyn, and to inform shareholders.
So,
I mean,
so you're
we are
really
gonna
talking about this is going to get dealt with sometime next year,
Yes,
really,
nothing's
right?
going to happen, right.
Okay,
Yeah.
because I mean, I was hearing that this might get dealt with in November, December, so there's no chance of that.
No.
Okay. Yeah.
My problem came up in that we were originally, it was originally explained to us that this omnibus resolution was going to the city council in the fall. And at that point, you were going to ask that the damp tax get revoked immediately. And then eventually the guidelines would come up. So that felt very coercive in the sense that if you eliminate the damp tax, then unless you sign, you get no benefits, even though you've been going along and having board meetings, submitting financials, having audits, and all the right things, so that the focus of that 25% to 30% of the buildings that have issues, why aren't we focusing on those and correcting that? Another solution is why not ask to see those buildings that are doing well, or have a revolving period of time that people can accept and move from one tax bracket or real estate tax to the next, in the sense that making it such a drastic cutoff, people who have come in and expected this to go to 2029, there's 15 more years or 14 more years that they thought was going, and they built their life around it accordingly. And now to have that pulled out from under you just doesn't feel transparent.
Fair enough. I'm going to ask you to wrap up with quick comments. Let me say this. I believe that HDFC coalitions and you guys should come up with a plan for the problems, right? Look, HPD is moving forward with this regulatory agreement, but I think there are some clear issues that we hear about all the time that you know they're there. Maybe it's not your HDFC, maybe it's another one. If HPD is trying to propose a way to deal with those, I think that it's incumbent upon you to say, you know what, we have a better solution, whatever that is, and present it, but not just say we're against HPD's plan. This is just my opinion. Go ahead.
I'm actually really glad you asked that. So the HDFC Steering Coalition sat down at HPD with Deputy Commissioner Anne Marie Henriksen and Mark and the small, unfortunately small staff they have at HPD for this. And we wanted, as soon as we heard about this, we worked to get this appointment. We got the appointment. And essentially, you know, they said, well, this is what it is. We've been working on it for over a year, a long time, blah, 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 blah. And we said, well, are you open to discussing this? The answer was no, we're going forward.
Gotcha.
And the word was they were going to the city council. So we saw this as a gun to our head.
Gotcha.
We had no choice and no time but to oppose it, get the word out, and organize and as quickly as possible. Now, I would like to say publicly that the HDFC Coalition would love to sit down again with HPD and talk about what we could do. But
to deal with some of the problems.
Until we see that they're willing to really talk and not just take comments and still do what they say they're going to do, then it's not necessarily the environment that would be most conducive to having that real conversation, but we are more than ready.
Fair enough. Well, listen, we've run out of time. I would like to thank Gayle Davis, John McBride, and Mark Matthews for joining me for a very spirited conversation. I'm Brian Benjamin. Thank you for watching this edition of Represent NYC on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Goodbye.